Hey guys, how's it going? It's your boy M.K.S here, back with another video, and welcome part 2 of my questions to ask Celtic supporters. Excuse me. I was just thinking, I guess, like one question I could ask is, what do you think about this game? I didn't really get to see it. I was trying to spend time with Mum for her birthday, but as they were watching films, and I don't really watch many films, I decided not to, although I did spend a bit of time with Mum, um, but yeah, so to be fair, I did have a really nice meal. And we spent a bit of time together as a family. So yeah, I didn't really get to watch the game, but I was keeping an eye on the score. Um, so yeah, I was keeping an eye on some other scores as well. Unfortunately, worst of all, I'm not sure which is the worst result. Rangers winning 3-0. Well, they are a bit behind us, but it could be that they're catching up with us, which I suppose they are. And I hope their new manager doesn't do that well, but I fear he might do well. He could be a very organised German manager and all that kind of thing. Being German, I know how organised they are and how good they are at football and all that kind of thing. But I hope it doesn't work out for them, obviously. But I know they won 3-0 and Hearts drew 1-1, which means we're still a bit behind them. But we are catching up with them. And they drew their last couple of games. So they've dropped about 4 points. So we've gained on them. It shows how far behind we were. Brenda, as I called him. But at the same time, hopefully we're going to catch up with them, and hopefully we'll break Hearts. And ideally, I'd love for us to win a treble. I know in part 1 I asked people what their dreams are for Celtic sports, what their dreams are, for the club. But yeah, as per usual, I failed at keeping the intro nice and short and sweet. About a minute or even 30 seconds or whatever. I failed in that initiative, but it is what it is, as I say. But anyway, these are questions number 11 to 20. So I hope Celtic supporters and even supporters of footy, soccer, calcio football, or whatever you want to call it, generally will get involved in your thoughts on Celtic and things like that. So yeah, we're catching up, and hopefully we'll get ahead of Hearts, all being well. Hopefully we'll break Hearts, as I put it, and win the league. And most importantly, I suppose, is to win the league. That's the main objective. But then hopefully we'll win a double or even a treble, all being well. I know we're in one final already, so hopefully as we're in the final, I hope we win that the Premier Cup, or whatever it's called, and I hope we'll win the I was going to say the World Club Cup. Then I may dream, but I hope we'll win the Super Cup. What's it called? The Scottish League, Scottish Cup. Sorry, but most importantly, the league, I guess. But I'd love to know what are your top priorities and what are your biggest dreams for the club, and say like what trophies would you like to win the most? I suppose the Champions League and the World Club Cup would be at the top of the list. I guess the fact we've won the equivalent of the Champions League would mean for me winning the World Club Cup, and I guess to win the World Cup, you have to win the Champions League anyway to get there. So I guess that would be my top priority. But anyway, moving on to the list, second part of the list rather. Sorry, I didn't quite find out. Here goes. So number 11. What do you think the club could do to improve? I suppose that requires change. So I guess what do you think the club should change? I was thinking that question in multiple parts. So what do you think the club should change, and what do you think the club should do? What do you think the club should do to improve, and what do you think the club should change to make those improvements? And I think it reminds me of, or I sort of connect it with question number 2, which is in part 1, obviously. Question number 2, I sort of asked, what could we learn from other clubs? What could we implement, even maybe from Real Madrid, Barcelona, Roma, Lazio, Juventus, or any Atalanta, Man United, or any other clubs? I know I mentioned like it's difficult to say whether we would be in a position to copy some of the things Barcelona or Real Madrid do. Barcelona or Real Madrid, because they play at a different level. So would that work in Scotland? I don't know. Maybe there are some things we could implement in terms of, at least in marketing, or at least some of those things, if not all of them, that other clubs do. But again, I'd love to know what you think the club could do. But yeah, learning from other clubs, that's something we could do differently perhaps. But yeah, I'd love to know what you think the club could do different, even in terms of recruitment, scouting, or whatever it might be. Play more attacking, or again, whatever you think the club could do to improve, which requires change. I know I do struggle with that, being very stubborn, but and being quite rebellious myself. But moving on, number 12, if you could pick any manager, who would it be? If you could pick any manager for the club, thinking of the topic of these videos, asking the Celtic supporters, like, so yeah, I suppose that's what I'm doing, like asking, excuse me, who would you bring to the club? And I guess I'm thinking more from a realistic point of view, like, given the funds the club has and the potential the club has, therefore, I guess so much of it is about how much money you have, I guess, of course. But based on what the club has, who could the club buy? Who do you think the club should bring in as the next manager? Do you think we should stick with Martin O'Neill, or do you think we should bring a new manager? If so, should we bring him in soon and say goodbye to Martin O'Neill quickly, and then move on to, obviously, thank him for his service and all that kind of thing, and stepping in at such a short notice? But who could the club get? And maybe thinking like out of the box, sort of thinking, oh yeah, a new up and coming manager, but someone who could excite the supporters, like someone who plays attacking football or whatever it might be. And also, who would you bring in as like coaches, the coach, coaching staff, dietitian, a dietitian or dietitians, a director of football, or what players would you bring in, given what funds the club have, like. And again, I wonder if the club could do more scouting in Germany, Spain, France, Italy, Argentina, Brazil, all over Latin America, and all over the world, even Africa and Asia and places like that. But could the club find any bargain buys, even as a manager, coach, coaching staff, players, or whatever, director of football, dietitians, or whatever? Again, I'd love to know who you would bring in the club from a realistic point of view, like who could the club afford to bring in, given our finances and that kind of thing, given our financial circumstances, and how can the club continue to have ongoing success? Number 13, what do you think are some of the weaknesses of the club, and what are some of your fears about the club? And I suppose one of my fears, personally, I don't know, I'm trying to ask other supporters, but one of my fears is like, what if Danny Roll, the new Rangers manager, what if he really is really good and he just needs time to implement his strategies, heaven forbid, and they go ahead of us? And also, what if Hearts managed to win the league? I forgot to say in the intro that they had 2 or 3 goals, which the opposition, Dundee. I was thinking I'd love for Celtic to win, but also Dundee and Dundee United, and I think it was Dundee United who were playing Hearts, and I was thinking apparently they had 2 or 3 decisions, goals that were ruled off, so I'm not sure how fair they are. I think someone said at least one of those goals should have stood, but I didn't see the game, so it would be unfair to comment. But if they do win the league by a point or two, it could come back to something like that. I think, oh, those decisions really made a massive difference and costed us. But I guess my biggest fears I talked about in the past would be like if we got relegated, especially after mocking them, they who shouldn't be mentioned, they who shouldn't be named, those from Mordor, like the rankers, as they call them. But also, if we got points deductions, or if we got relegated or we got points deductions, that would be some of my biggest fears. But I'd love to know from other sports, like, what would be your biggest fears for the club? I know something that happened in the past. I don't know if I want to mention this in point number 13, because I don't want to jinx it, but at the same time, it is a negative point. I know I've mentioned it a few times, but unfortunately, a child abuse scandal that happened at the boys club in the past. I've often mentioned I hope it wasn't too many people involved in it, but it's quite an embarrassing time for the club. But it's something that is shameful, and it could put off investors or sponsors or whatever. But yeah, if we got relegated or got points deductions or stuff like that, that would be quite a negative and scary thing to think about. I know it's only football, you might say, but or whatever. But yeah, it's something I hope doesn't happen. But I do hope we do pay to support like people victims of abuse or whatever. But yeah, I'd love to know what your biggest fears are for the club. Just out of interest, it'll be interesting. I suppose I'd love to know what the answers to all these questions. That would probably be the one I'd love to know the least, because it is obviously quite a negative one. But number 14. But yeah, I'd love to know what your solutions would be for the club to solve problems of its own, or answerable problems. Like, how can the club solve problems in terms of working with FIFA and UEFA and charities and NGOs to tackle climate change, global warming, and that kind of thing. Number 15, I'd love to know what your realistic goals for the club are for the next 5 to 10 years. So I love to dream, as you can probably tell in my videos, and I have vivid imagination, and I'm very much an idealist. But from the realists out there, I guess I kind of can be a realist, but I don't like to be a realist. But what would you like to see happen? And again, within the club's finances, what are your goals for the club? And I know I mentioned this in part one, kind of, but for those who want to get rid of the board and replace it with a new board, how could you have the ambition to do well in Europe at the same time? So I'm not sure if the same supporter sort of says, or some supporters who believe like we should get rid of the board, but then we can do well in Europe without replacing them with wealthy investors. Like, what are some more realistic sort of solutions? And again, what are your realistic goals for the club? Like, I don't know, winning a league, maybe a double or even a treble or something like that, or whatever you think is more realistic for the club, given the club's finances. Again, like coming to things like the manager, coaching staff, director of football, dietitians, players and whatnot. What are some realistic players the club could get? And maybe like how could the club get some good bargain buys? I suppose players we brought to a club like Henrik Larsson, and even players we got recently like Maeda, short-term players like that, I don't think they cost a huge amount. So I guess those are some ways you can find bargains and find players, especially up-and-coming players who aren't very well known yet, but could turn into really great players. I suppose it is a risk. Sometimes you'll buy a player and think they could turn into a great player, and unfortunately it doesn't work out. But maybe some supporters out there could do your own scouting and see players and say, oh yeah, we should bring this guy. He could be quite good. We should bring this manager in, this coach in, this player in, or whatever it might be. Those, or even two, or even all three, or even a number of those things. If that makes sense. So yeah, it could be specifically a manager, or specifically a coach, or specifically a player, or players, or even two, or even all three of those things. I'll say. Number 16, what do you think could benefit the club? What could the club do to get more supporters all around the world to find out about the club, to promote the image of the club, and what could the club do, I'll say, to brand itself better, market itself, brand itself, whatever, i.e. make itself more known, I guess, and that kind of thing, and what sort of things could benefit the club. Again, what some bargain buys the club could get, what some ways the club could raise funds, obviously as long as they're legal, but how could the club get more investors, sponsors, and funds more generally? I have my own ideas about like what if Celtic could work with the SNP, Plaid Cymru, Fianna Fáil, if I pronounce them right, and all those different Celtic political parties, Celtic and Gaelic political parties. But yeah, I'd love to know any ideas you have out there, any Celtic sports, what ideas do you have? Number 17, I mentioned before about like more realistic sort of stuff based on the club's finances, but I love to dream, and I'm very much an idealist. So I'd love to know what, if the club had unlimited funds, who would you like to see brought in, or how would you like to see the clubs spend the money? I mean, some people might say, well, obviously players like Mbappe or Haaland, but there might be some who say actually they could be better players that, well, not necessarily better, but or a better fit for Celtic or a better fit for Scottish football. Or maybe you might even think some players are overrated or only do well because they play in a certain system. And I guess not. Sometimes it's not always the best named players. There might be some who you think are underrated, someone you might think are overrated, someone you might think are underrated. But I guess if the club had unlimited funds and could spend them, I guess with FFP rules they wouldn't really be able to do so. But if they could spend the money, obviously we could buy and bring in all sorts of players and take risks and stuff like that. But yeah, I'd love to hear from supporters like what sort of things you would like to see from a more dream perspective, more dream-driven perspective. So, as I say, it could even be in things like bringing in certain managers. Like if you could pick any manager, like Jurgen Klopp, um, even Pep, I don't know, Pep Guardiola or whoever. If you could bring any manager to the club, like who would it be? Any coaching staff, director of football, dietitian, or whatever. Who would it be? And if you could get any player or players, who would they be? And even like dreams about like what trophies you'd like to see us win, and things like that. So like winning Champions Leagues even or stuff like that. I'd love to know what sports in. Like I think it'd be amazing if Celtic could one day win the World Club Cup in 10 or 15 years maybe, or something like that. Or even 5 years if I'm really dreaming or whatever. It'd be hard to see, but it'd be amazing if we could. Number 18, what are some good causes the club could support? What are some charities, NGOs, or whatever, good causes? Or whatever that you think the club could support, like STEM across Africa or things like that. Number 19, I'd love to support STEM in Africa, and I'd love to know what you think. Do you think the club could do more and should do more, and maybe could find a way to support like STEM education for Africa and that kind of thing? And number 20, how can we support like people of all ages, young, old, and whatnot? I'd love to know as ever. And I'm out. Peace out.